Clive, welcome to the programme. You just said, see it for what it is. You see that golden carriage, see it for what it is. And what I see is grandeur and splendour, solemnity and pageantry, continuity, this wonderful continuum of history, a ceremony that we first saw, or those of our antecedents saw in 1066. What do you see? What should I be seeing?
Well, I mean, obviously, there's a lot of symbolism. It's very rich in that. And I think being defined as the Republican killjoy MP at a time when people want to celebrate and be happy, it's a kind of gloomy time at the moment with the cost of living crisis and all that's going on. It's not great optics for those of us who want to talk about this from a different perspective. I mean, the perspective I come at this is as a Democrat and someone who actually thinks that we should be able to question and engage about how we're ruled, who rules us, and what power we have as individuals and as members of societies within our demos, within our democracy, to be able to choose who our head of state is and to be able to say what kind of symbols we want to represent us. Now, there's lots of good things. My daughter is fascinated by this. She's 5. She does princesses and carriages and resplendent rituals and so on. She loves it. And I understand that. And there's a deep-seated part of us that loves that. But you can have that, many countries do, by also having an elected head of state, by also having someone who's accountable, by having someone as the head of state who's all the laws of the land apply to, who pays their tax, who pays inheritance
let
tax.
me interrupt to ask you. Let me ask you a question. Otherwise, it's a monologue, and I don't get to ask you anything. So give me a chance. Which are these countries that combine the glamour, the allure, and the resplendent celestial nature of princesses and fairy tale and ceremonial with a democratically elected head of state? Which are the countries you're thinking of that can combine both?
So you've got France, for example, that has a president and has France has a, look, I don't have to agree with the French system for how they pick their president, but France has if that's important to you, the regal splendor, then France, the Palace of Versailles, all those things, and the presidential palace, all of that's there. I think what's important
but all of that's there. Look, the Palace of Versailles exists, certainly it does. But, you know, President Macron and his wife having a bun or a baguette or whatever they want to have in the dining room of the Palace at Versailles is nothing like the equivalent of the late Queen's extraordinary funeral, that unifying queue which went on and on, it seemed forever and ever. And I had the privilege of filming in it and talking to the people who had congregated and who'd come from all sorts of countries all over the world to be there. And they didn't know how long they were going to have to be there, and they were going to have to stand all night, and they were going to be freezing cold and boiling hot alternately and everything else. And they were there to pay homage because they felt this deep kind of personal, spiritual, emotional connection. That's what your daughter feels. That's why she likes princesses and carriages. And we don't have that in France.
But she's a 5-year-old, and with all due respect, I understand those sentiments. I understand people's feelings for that, but it can be expressed in other ways. Other countries do it. And also I'm a Democrat first. And I think that for me is why, you know, look, if King Charles wants to be head of state, let him stand in an election or put himself forward to do that. But I think the reality here is the fact that we have a monarchy for which we don't give consent. You know, there is no sense of consent in this. Do we live in a democracy, or do we live? We don't. We live in a constitutional monarchy. So it's just about being honest about the kind of country we live in.
You're busily answering all your own questions. You're answering your own questions.
What you're asking me, Vanessa, is do I like pomp and ceremony and ritual? And lots of people feel very attached to the monarchy, and that's true. Yes. There are lots of people that feel that, but there are also lots of people that would like to have a say over who their head of state is. Would like to have a say, but do they believe a hereditary billionaire should be the person that is put up on this pedestal and symbolizes the values of this country? I personally think that having a hereditary billionaire in a democracy, there's something that is kind of fundamentally wrong with that. And I know there are millions of other people in this country. Let's have that conversation. Let's have that discussion.
Except, of course, that at the very beginning of your diatribe, monologue, whatever you want to call it, soliloquy, I might even say, to give you a little bit of Shakespearean sanctity. Why not? Your soliloquy, you said, you know, these people who rule over us, and that's dreadfully disingenuous, isn't it? You know perfectly well that we live in a democracy, because we have an elected, democratically elected government and a democratically elected cabinet, you know, from within the members of parliament that we have elected. And you know perfectly well that the royal family don't rule over us. They don't make any pronouncements or rulings to which you have to adhere, do they?
Let's unpack this. Who do you think Parliament has sovereignty?
Do I think Parliament what?
Has sovereignty. Sovereignty is where power lies. Who do you think has sovereignty? Do you think me as an MP and as part of Parliament has sovereignty?
I think the King has no sovereignty over any choices made in your life. I think everything that pertains to the way you live, whether the potholes in your road are filled, whether there's an ECG machine at the hospital that you use, whether you're arrested or stopped and searched, none of that whatsoever emanates from the sovereign or from Buckingham Palace or anything else. Also, I think your use of the phrase hereditary billionaire is desperately unhelpful. Let's go, though, to somebody else who would like to discuss this with you, and that's Richard Fitzwilliams, who is a royal commentator. Richard, welcome to the programme. You hear what Clive has to say. What would you like to say in response to him?
Well, of course, I thoroughly enjoyed Clive's soliloquies. I must pay him tribute that that eloquence may I suggest a little bit of Fantasyland? I mean, firstly, the serious aspects of this, of course, because it's a time of a cost of living crisis. It's a difficult period for many people. Indeed, it has been with COVID as well. What we've got coming up is clearly a fantastic piece of theatre which the world is tuning into, but also it's very meaningful. And regarding the purpose of monarchy, I do think it's very important. National unity and also above party politics. Now, Clive was talking about being in a democracy and people wanting to elect their head of state. Now, well, if that is the case, could he please explain to me why not one single major political party supports a republic? They don't. And the other thing I'd love explained, we've seen some polls recently, and certainly it's been a tough time for the monarchy. He knows that, I know that, we all know that. And the same was the case in the 1990s, the same was the case in the 1930s at the time of the abdication. The same indeed was the case in the 1860s when Victoria went into seclusion after Albert's tragic death. The monarchy's had all sorts of ups and downs before. It goes back over 1,000 years. The ceremony does to King Edgar in 973 AD. The one interregnum we've had since then was, of course, Cromwell. Now, may I just firstly mention Versailles, because Clive was saying, and I don't doubt he sincerely means it, that Republic would still keep the palaces open and so forth. The point is, though, that it's a mausoleum when it's meaningless. When you've got changing the guard, there's actually a king there, or king and queen there, or recently, which we had the late Queen Elizabeth, who I think everyone agreed, or pretty well everybody, was an exemplar when it came to duty and service. I mean, it's meaningful. Versailles, anyway, if you go around there, it's a bit pretty empty, isn't it? The Republicans flogged all the furniture. And if you look at the regalia being used at the coronation on Saturday, the Republicans melted it all down. That was Cromwell's in 1649. Of course, they cut King Charles's head off.
Let's ask Clive if he has an appetite for grabbing the crown jewels and melting them down and making some serviceable knives and forks and spoons to be used in canteens all the way across the country out of them, greasy spoons. Would you like that?
Yeah, that would be a rather silly way of approaching this discussion and this debate, and I think it wouldn't do it justice. I think so. Let's just pick up some of those points. Why have none of those political parties advocated for a republic? Well, probably because we have a first past the post voting system, which means we have a duopoly. And I think if we had a form of PR where people could vote for the political party that they actually wanted, you'd probably find that some Republican parties would begin to materialize and appear. Secondly, I think in terms of this whole notion that we need a royal family to attract visitors to this country, I think people come to this country for a variety of reasons. The people, the country, the history, and yes, the royal family, but there will still be visitors coming to this country if there was a royal family or not. I think I understand, look, change is difficult. And I think my key point in my soliloquy that I made was simply the point that the values that we espouse within our democracy, within our society, within our economy are represented, should be represented in the head of state. I don't really want to see a kind of US or French-style president. I would like to see someone who could be a playwright, a scientist. The values that we hold dear, a fireman, a nurse, a doctor. We could choose someone that represented the values that we respect in this country. I don't think that's a million miles away from the fact that, you know, you want a king. I personally want someone that there's some accountability for. They can be separate from the government of the country and they can represent those best interests. So, and I think just to finish on this point, symbols are important. And what having a billionaire hereditary head of state says, that it is acceptable for some people to exempt themselves from laws, acceptable for some people to exempt themselves from paying tax. And that trickles down into the rest of the country. So those with money, with wealth, with power also can begin to think that they can be exempted.
All right, give Richard a chance. Give Richard a chance to respond to that, please.
Quite important.
Richard, what would you say? Do you think billionaires with offshore companies are doing so to emulate the former Prince Charles, now King Charles? Is that what it is? He's shown a poor example.
Well, firstly, I just want to comment on a point that Clive was making with reference to choices. It's very important that we look at what the monarchy actually stands for. The fact that debates about the cost and so forth are another issue. But when you have, for example, the question of to be advised, to advise, to be encouraged, to warn, not what the power the monarch has, but the power in the commander-in-chief of the armed forces, head of this judiciary, civil service, the church, the power that they deny to others. I think it's a very important point. And when you talk of democracy, I mean, I think it's important to remember not only that there's still 14 other Commonwealth countries, and the Queen nurtured the Commonwealth. She ought to get a lot of credit for that.
Gentlemen, I'm afraid I've got to wrap it up there, but thank you both for joining me. Very interesting, very energetic, very forceful, thoroughly enjoyable. Thank you very much indeed. Socratic discourse at its very best.